Welcome to all of our viewers from across the country, and thank you to those of you participating on today's panel who will meet shortly. Admiral Thad Allen, Captain Bruce Jones, and Scott Cooper of Crescent Towing. My name is Phil Noel, and I host the Had to Go Out podcast, which tells the most dangerous, daring, and epic sea stories of Coast Guard veterans. I'm excited to be a part of today's Stories That Matter virtual event hosted by the National Coast Guard Museum Association. The National Coast Guard Museum Association is committed to building a world-class museum that will honor the heritage of the U.S. Coast Guard and provide a public gateway to discover Coast Guard life. In its 80,000 square feet and 5 decks, it will showcase thousands of stories through interactive exhibits, programs, public and private partnerships, STEM-based educational programs, and leadership training opportunities. The incredible legacy of heroism, bravery, and professional competence demonstrated by this oft unnoticed multi-mission service needs to be understood by American citizens, and the extraordinary work of the United States Coast Guard deserves to be preserved, memorialized, and honored, and currently is the only armed service without a national museum. The Museum Association will deliver the museum through its When the Most is Expected campaign, a public-private partnership. To date, the Museum Association has reached $72 million in private, state, and federal commitments toward its $150 million goal. And momentum continues to build from the announcement of a 2024 museum opening by Coast Guard Commandant Admiral Carl Schultz. One of the wings in the museum will showcase the Coast Guard as lifesavers around the globe, displaying that during daily operations and in times of crisis, heroic teams of Coast Guard men and women work together to save lives on land, sea, and air, on 7 continents all over the globe. One of the stories in this wing of the museum will be the Coast Guard's response to Hurricane Katrina, which made landfall 15 years ago this week. In response to the hurricane, the Coast Guard launched what would become the largest search and rescue mission in the nation's history, and it drew on resources from every corner of the nation with no significant loss to its own personnel, assets, operations, or financial resources. The Coast Guard rescued more than 33,500 people. And in today's discussion, the 15th anniversary of the Coast Guard response to Hurricane Katrina, we'll hear directly from several individuals who played key leadership roles in the response and recovery to the hurricane. If you have any questions for our guests, I encourage you to send them to us via the chat function for our question and answer session that we'll have at the end of this presentation. To kick off the discussion, I'd like to introduce you to Captain Bruce Jones, who commanded Coast Guard Air Station New Orleans when Hurricane Katrina made landfall, and who led aviation rescue operations over New Orleans. Captain Jones, welcome, sir.
Hey, good afternoon, Phil. Great to be here. Thanks for letting me be part of this conversation. So Katrina was such a massive and complex operation. We could talk all day and barely scratch the surface and really have a hard time conveying the intensity that those on scene felt. So what I'm going to do is just share some stories that I hope will represent some of what our amazing Coast Guard men and women did, with apologies to all those who I leave out. With countless people in distress over a huge geographical area and chaos, which was exacerbated by the damage to our communications infrastructure, the transportation system, the energy system, and even local government, it was a very dynamic situation. That's an understatement. And so what it called for was a quick, nimble, agile response force of highly skilled, highly capable operators, conditioned to both risk management and ambiguity, able to take initiative, adapt, be courageous and tireless under mental and physical duress. So in short, this was a disaster custom made for the Coast Guard, because that is what Coasties do. That's who we are. Right now, as we speak, Air Station New Orleans is preparing to respond to support Hurricane Laura operations under Commanding Officer Pat Dill. 15 years ago, Pat was one of my junior officers and a brand new aircraft commander. Pat and his family had evacuated to safe haven. The morning after Katrina, he hitched a ride on a helicopter, found his way back to New Orleans, and that night he was aircraft commander on a crew flying rescue missions, and over 5 nights his crew saved 105 lives. Like all the H-65 Bravo pilots in Katrina, Pat's flying skills were put to the test at the controls of an underpowered helicopter in its worst possible environment: extreme high heat and humidity, high power requirements for hovering out of ground effect, heavy survivor loads, surrounded by dangerous obstacles which severely restricted our flyout options at the most critical phase of flight, and nearly always fuel critical. because of the minimal fuel loads the 65 could carry in those conditions. And you never knew whether the next survivor to get in the basket was going to be a child or a 375-pound adult. So basically, every time a 65 Bravo pilot came into a hover in the 100-degree heat, staring at power lines, buildings, and trees, we were sucking the seat cushion up in our cheeks and counting the seconds. It was not for the faint of heart. Lieutenant JG Maria Rorick reported aboard the day after Katrina, after just completing her flight training the week before. I said, "Welcome aboard," and Ops told her to put on her flight suit and pointed her to a helicopter. And for the next 3 days, her first 3 days in Coast Guard aviation, she flew 11 sorties as a co-pilot, and her crew saved 74 lives. Welcome aboard, Maria. Maria got another chance to shine less than 4 weeks later when Hurricane Rita slammed ashore to our west as a Cat 5. Knowing roughly where distress was likely to happen in my AOR, I launched all 5 of our helicopters at dawn as the storm came ashore. And that morning, Coast Guard helicopters operating independently outside of the DoD's assigned grid system, based on local reports, and literally landing on roads to ask local officials where help was needed, saved 60 lives from Hurricane Rita in winds up to 60 knots and quarter-mile visibility. And they did all this before the DoD assets offshore aboard the Iwo Jima even got airborne. Nimble, flexible, responsive. That's what the Coast Guard is. Back to Katrina. On August 29, as day turned to night, we saw hundreds of tiny lights start to flicker over the dark city. We realized these were flashlights and candles and lighters that survivors were using to signal for help. My rescue swimmer, Dave Foreman, pointed out a light and asked me to circle in, take a look. We deployed Dave to a second-story window where, as he was hanging from the eave, he could see 5 elderly people trapped inside the bedroom. He broke the window with his gloves and his boots. He assessed the situation. He asked us to leave him on scene and go get fuel while he took care of the survivors. He got each one out of the window in the dark, swam them to a rooftop where he waited for us to come back and hoist them all to safety. Over the next week, Dave saved 118 lives on 11 sorties. And this is the same guy, Dave Foreman, who 18 months earlier earned the Coast Guard medal on the Bow Mariner case. That's where a chemical tanker exploded off of Chincoteague with ethanol, toxic fumes, toxic water. He deployed into 44-degree water with those chemicals to save survivors. So, incredible hero. On 30 August, which is the day after Katrina came ashore, Senior Chief Bosun Mate Stephen Noyes, who is the OIC of Ant Dulac, motored into New Orleans aboard the 55119, along with the Pamlico, the Clamp, 2 other 55-footers, and I think 8 41-footers, which had pre-positioned in Baton Rouge. Under the Pamlico CO's leadership, that's Dave Leewald, working with local commercial vessels, they quickly assessed the unfolding situation and rescued or transported several thousand survivors. And I think you'll hear more about that from Mr. Cooper shortly. The junior petty officers on these boat crews quickly overcame their shock and awe at the situation, and they adapted to many unexpected and non-traditional Coast Guard tasks like crowd control, disarming survivors, clearing landing zones for helicopters, and treating injuries, including some gunshots. Over at Zephyr Field, Lieutenant Commander Shannon Gilreath was directing Coast Guard boat rescue operations and also co-leading a unified command of multiple state, local, and federal agencies, and in charge of about 100 boats and 850 people. Our boat crews navigated over streets with submerged cars, buses, power lines, street signs, fences, and all kinds of other obstacles. They dealt with gunfire and utter chaos, doing urban search and rescue that they had never been trained for. And initially, they didn't even have porta potties, much less any facilities to sleep, eat, wash, or rest. And the Coasties at Zephyr Field just did amazing and heroic work for over a week and rescued thousands of people. One example, on September the 4th, a few days after doctors had told them that if there was anyone still trapped in their attics, they're probably dead. There was a dart crew over by ISC New Orleans. They turned off their motor just to listen, and they heard some faint tapping. They found a man at a second-story window covered with bars. They cut a hole in the roof. The man was in there with his 87-year-old mother. They'd been lying in water for 6 days, and they were saved because this dart crew took the initiative just to turn off their motor and listen. Meanwhile, over at Algiers and Forward Operating Base New Orleans, Lieutenant Commander Sean Regan, who was the CEO of MSST NOLA, led over 400 boat crew and security personnel, rescuing and assisting thousands. One of these was BM2 Jessica Goudreau's of Station New Orleans. She took charge of a flotilla of 12 boats, 2 ox boats and 10 Coast Guard boats, and they evacuated 2,200 people from the levee around the University of New Orleans over multiple days, including suppressing what eventually became essentially a riot by many of the understandably frustrated and angry survivors. Our rescue swimmers were just phenomenal. They completed thousands of individual difficult and often dangerous rescues off balconies, rooftops, vehicles, and in fetid floodwaters. Imagine being one of these swimmers, completely drained after several days of continuous rescue operations, day and night, and being lowered to a nursing home, as happened to several of our swimmers, only to find the shocking sight of dead and dying elderly people inside who had been abandoned. Imagine the smells of this foul water filled with chemicals, sewage, decaying plant and animal matter, sadly, human beings as well. And this is water into which our rescuers immerse themselves in order to get into flooded homes and attics. Imagine the disbelief felt by our boat crews when on more than one occasion, they brought boatloads of survivors from Orleans Parish to the adjoining parish boundary and were met with guns pointed at them by law enforcement officers telling them they did not want Orleans Parish survivors there. Or the frustration of being told by hospitals, you cannot bring even critical patients in because they could not care for their own patients. Being told you couldn't bring your survivors to a crowded landing zone with no shelter or medical care for thousands of survivors, but there's no other place to bring them. Extreme frustration and stress that built up over days for our crews. Within days, the sky over New Orleans was filled with helicopters operating in close proximity at low altitude. A traffic separation was just keeping your eyes on a swivel and making radio calls. There were lots of close calls. There were reports of guns being fired at aircraft. There's smoke from fires that obscured visibility, and just the intense stress that grew every day with knowing that there were still thousands of people to be rescued and that with every passing day, their chance of survival diminished. One of my guys, just as an example, Lieutenant Craig O'Brien, he hitched a ride back to New Orleans the day after Katrina. He flew 20 night sorties at low altitude next to unlit obstacles, saved 145 lives. And then every night after sleeping in his office for a bit, he'd work a day shift in the ops center and then go fly all night again. And one night he was flying over downtown New Orleans. He looked at a street sign and realized he was hovering just a block or two from his own flooded house. And Craig, like all of our other folks in the boat crews and helicopter crews whose own homes had been destroyed, never once asked for any time off to take care of their own situation until we rescued every last person. Also, Coast Guard liaison officers that we assigned to multiple interagency command posts, people like Val Boyd at the state EOC, Sherry Ben Ayasow at the New Orleans City Hall Emergency Operations Center, many others. They made a huge impact because they could speak with competence and with authority well above their pay grade and get things done, coordinating logistics and rescue operations. So those are just a few of thousands of stories I could tell you and Admiral Allen could tell you. Before closing, I do want to salute Captain Frank Paskowich, who was brilliantly effective as the sector commander in New Orleans, Captain Dave Callahan, who as the CEO of Aviation Training Center Mobile oversaw a massive aviation logistics and rescue operation. And finally, my amazing crew at Air State New Orleans, including our XO Witherspoon Leadership Award winner Scott Kitchen, our OPSO Tim Tobias, our Command Master Chief Tim Scheffler, EM2 Rodney Gordon, who was the 2005 Enlisted Person of the Year. I'll summarize by saying that after Katrina, I saw remarkable leadership demonstrated at all levels of the organization, officer and enlisted. And I saw junior people being given more responsibility and less oversight than they had ever had before, and they rose to the occasion. I saw coasties who were exhausted reach out to support others, lend a hand, and do whatever needed to get done to help people out. I saw honor, respect, and devotion to duty personified every day. And in the end, you know, it really is all about our people, and the Coast Guard has great people and a great mission. Thanks.
Captain Jones, that was pretty incredible. I think you ran the entire gamut from, I love hearing the stories of the first day on the job and, you know, your most pilots out there all the time. And then all the way to the non-ray leading the dark crews out there. That's pretty impressive. Thanks for your leadership during that time, sir. Thanks for sharing your story here with us.
Thank you.
Our next guest is Scott Cooper, president of Crescent Towing, whose employees aided in the immediate response and recovery efforts following the hurricane. Welcome, Mr. Cooper.
Good morning for those Central Time folks. Good afternoon for some of y'all as well. I can't believe it's been 15 years. And here, ironically, almost to the day, the Gulf Coast is preparing for another massive storm. Thoughts and prayers go out to those who will be affected here in the coming hours. You know, as far as Crescent Towing's Katrina experience, there's many facets, many different twists and turns. And all I can say is this: first and foremost, there's a lot of great mariners all around this earth. After working alongside and working with my group of my team members, the mariners at Crescent Towing, I truly feel that I've got some of the best on the planet. You know, we all have jobs, and some of us get caught up in the day-to-day, and we think this is our job or that's our job, and you know, you get in this silo. My guys, first and foremost, jumped in with both feet. The answer was yes to any question. We faced so many different challenges, you know, and some cool stories of that or examples of that. I had tug captains that were helping fight fires. I had tug captains that were helping rebuild something that had gotten destroyed on land. I had them helping tie and untie vessels. You know, going back to August 28th, that Sunday, woke up that morning and the storm had blown up, a lot like this morning if you turn on the Weather Channel, with intense rapid intensification overnight. Katrina blew up, and I didn't know what to prepare for. I'd heard stories of previous storms. At the time, I was 28 years old and scared to death. Went to work that morning, and sometime around noon that Sunday, I was sitting around talking to our guys. We had 15 boats crewed. And we had some dispatch and some shoreside folks that were going to stay back and stay on our office barge there at our headquarters in Algiers, Crescent Towing's headquarters. And the guys were getting nervous, naturally so, but they were willing to do the job. And like I've said so many times before, Crescent Towing operated as a ship assist tug company before, during, and after the storm. That afternoon, it dawned on me as I was sitting in dispatch, you know, not only are we in the ship assist tug business, but we're in the line handling business. We tie and untie vessels. We use vans and launch boats to do that. It dawned on me that if this storm is half as advertised, we're not going to have any of those assets to be able to work after the storm. So we decided to move the dispatch group in those mooring vans that I'm talking about up to our Cooper T. Smith stevedoring, now Cooper Consolidated office at mile 175 on the Mississippi, Darrow, Louisiana. Thank God we did that, and it was a lucky call to say the least, because myself and Frank Altabella and a couple other guys that were sitting in there with me, Mouse Hughes, we might not be here today, because during the storm, the Chios Beauty, a vessel moored across the river from us there at a Port of New Orleans wharf, broke free. And even though some of our tugs were through heroic efforts tried to save the ship from colliding into the office, this was not one of our accounts, but them just being solid mariners, they tried to take charge of the situation. It landed on top of our office barge. Going to see the dispatch room about 20 hours later, I probably wouldn't be sitting here today doing this for dang sure. Not saying we would have lost our lives, but I don't see how we would have come out of that alive. It would have been a mess for sure. So by getting lucky in that early decision, we were able, in being upriver, we were able to save our own lives and save those assets, those vans, and a few mooring boats. Fast forward to about 0800, August 29th, in the height of the storm, getting some phone calls that I tried to block out of my memory, out of my mind, because it was a scary time for those folks, a scary time for all of us. I hopped on a harbor tug and came back into the storm, back down to the city. By the time I got there, some of the views you see on the screen are some of the memories I have. The containers at Nashville Avenue, Port of New Orleans, were thrown around like a kid's Legos in a windstorm. Just the images were ungodly. But at the end of the day, I pull up and I've got 78 guys standing there, and had a few bruises. I had one twisted knee, but everybody was alive, and our equipment was in good shape besides our office barge and the two unmanned tugs that we had, the Glenn Smith and the Virginia, were not crewed during the storm because we were in a process of revamping those. They had some mechanical issues and whatnot. So we get down there, and the next couple of days were a whirlwind. As a tugboat company, we were there to hold in ships during the storm. Got lucky, and in fact, again, I say it a lot because you can make your own luck, but we had a lot of things go our way. In the city, it ended up having a lot of things go their way. Holding in the Military Sea Lift Command vessels, keeping those safe during the storm. They ended up providing housing and fuel for the hospitals, for other various agencies around the city for the days, weeks, and months to follow. The chaos that the Captain Jones was talking about, I got to see some of that from a peripheral vantage point. We weren't caught up in that day to day until about 3 days into the storm, and I get that in the recovery. I'll get to that in a second. Shortly after, let's say Monday, Tuesday, we start pulling ships off the ground and doing some things that we can do. And it was awkward for us, or I say awkward, it was odd for us because our crews are used to being spread out. There's a picture of our office barge there and the two tugs that I mentioned. You see that top left corner of the barge there, that's where our dispatch office is. So that wouldn't have been a good place to be sitting. As we tried to help get the port back open, and I mean this with full sincerity, the coolest part for Scott Cooper and Crescent Towing is that not only the Crescent Towing team members, employees, families, everybody pulling together, but it was the help from the Coast Guard. You mentioned Frank Paskowich earlier. I talked to Captain Paskowich more than I ever dreamed I'd talk to him in the days leading up and the days following. Gary Lagrange from the Port of New Orleans. Everybody had their part. The pilots, we called it Clayson Station. It was so great to see that all three pilot groups pull together. But those Crescent pilots there, immediately following the storm, one of the great stories, and all the pilots there. One of the great stories that I remember was Captain Richie Ducrow. He flagged down a line haul vessel somewhere in Mississippi, I think near Natchez, and came back down. Everybody was willing to do whatever it took to get the job done, whether that was the Coast Guard, whether that was the NOPD, whether it was agencies that I'm not used to working with as a ship assist harbor tug provider. That's a great picture there. Captain Terry Murley there in the middle of the Point Clear. He and I were roommates for about 2 weeks. I don't know if he was looking forward to having the head of the company come stay with him, but he was nice enough to let me stay in his upper bunk there. But, everybody pulling together is what it's all about. And from that, I don't wish a storm of that magnitude on anybody, but it was cool how everybody came together in that brotherhood, that family went across all sectors of our industry. Everybody pulled together just to get the job done. And when the fires broke out at Mandeville Street, I want to say that was about day 3 into it, and it all kind of runs together. But we had 5 boats that just jumped right in and started fighting fires. A deckhand on the Point Clear there, Jay Enna, was a retired firefighter. He or a volunteer at that point, I believe. He put his gear on and went in to see what he could do, because there was plywood in those warehouses, and our fear was it was going to jump and run in the French Quarter, and who knows where it goes from there. The devastation down there was unbelievable, but the way people pulled together, I still get goosebumps to this day knowing that I was able to be a part of that team. And I'm honored to be a part of this today, to be able to share some of these stories. I'm not doing them justice. I could go on and on and on, but the fact that the Coast Guard, was at the Coast Guard Museum, was able to put this on today does mean a lot. It's ironic that here we are facing another storm. I do hope and pray that those affected by it in the coming days don't go through a lot of the things that we went through as a group, as an industry, as a port community, a port family. But we live and learn, and I think each storm since then, each disaster since Katrina, everybody's gotten a little better, and that's all we can ask for. So thank you for letting me be a part of today. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, Mr. Cooper, incredible reaction by your company and your captains to protect their own community. It reminds me of the anytime there's a search and rescue case, the Coast Guard always puts out that urgent marine information broadcast to get any mariner out there to come and assist. And it sounds like your guys answered that call when it mattered most. So excellent story, sir. Thanks for sharing. Yeah, before to the audience, before we get our final panelists here, just as a reminder, we're going to do a question and answer session here at the end. So if you guys have any questions for our guests, please go ahead and type them into the chat function, and we'll ask them there at the end. And with that, our final panelist is Admiral Thad Allen, the 23rd Commandant of the United States Coast Guard and the principal federal official for Hurricane Katrina's response and recovery. Admiral Allen, thanks for joining us today, sir.
Thanks, Phil. Great to be with you. Actually honored to be with Scott and Bruce Jones. Immense amount of respect for what these men have accomplished in their lives and the leaders they are. Let me start off with an overarching statement. Every one of these disasters becomes an exercise in applied civics. It involves all segments of society, federal, state, and local government. And the view I had of this was largely from the federal side and trying to coordinate what was going on after a week of chaos. But before I do that, let me just comment on Hurricane Paula. The path that Paula's taking is almost the exact same path that Rita took before it came ashore several weeks after Katrina. It decimated Cameron Parish, and we had floodwaters go 35 miles inland and inundate Lake Charles. I think you probably expect a similar storm surge. We were able to blunt the impact of that as much as we could because we already had forces on the ground in Joint Task Force Katrina, led by Lieutenant General Russ Honore. And before Rita's landfall, they maneuvered to Lafayette and had 3,000 people, and they hunkered down and they were able to go in with high water vehicles immediately after the storm passed through Lake Charles. So a big difference in our ability to respond to Rita because we had forces on the ground and we were prepared. Regarding Katrina, I was the Chief of Staff of the Coast Guard at the time. And in the week following landfall, I was in Washington, D.C., and I was subject to conversations about whether or not they should invoke martial law or waive posse comitatus and actually get involved with the federal presence managing what was going on in New Orleans. In the end, they decided that was not legally possible because there was a standing mayor and a governor. And the issue was, how do you make them more effective in doing their jobs? On Friday, after the storm came ashore, I was at a change of command at Group Chincoteague between two people that had worked for me before. Ron Lebrecht was leaving as a group commander, and Dana Reed, my former aide in the 7th District, were being relieved. So Pam and I were spending Labor Day weekend over on the Eastern Shore. I got a call from the Secretary's military advisor asking if I would go to New Orleans if asked. They were looking at alternatives. I didn't hear anything after that until Monday morning, the 5th of September, Labor Day. I got a call from Secretary Mike Chertoff, and he asked if I would go to New Orleans as a deputy principal federal official to Mike Brown and see if I could see what could be done about the chaos that had been inflicted on the city for the week that preceded that. And everybody saw the coverage, the breakdown of law and order in the Superdome and then the convention center. I had a conversation with my wife because I wasn't sure at that point if the windows hadn't closed to be able to increase the effectiveness of the response and the recovery. She was quick to remind me that my favorite definition of leadership is the ability to reconcile opportunity and competency. And thus being chastised, I said I was all in. So when the call came on Monday the 5th, I said I'd go. I had about 4 hours to prepare. Then Captain Cindy Coogan was my deputy chief of staff. I had to pass off an immense amount of things that were going on in Coast Guard headquarters. A plane was sent to Dulles to pick me up, HU-25 aircraft, and my aide Katrina Harper and I headed down to Baton Rouge. On the way to the airport, I made a call to several people that had worked for me before because I didn't know what I was walking into, but I knew I would need a strong cast around me. I called Tom Acton, who ran the deployable boat forces for me in Atlantic area after the 9/11 attacks. I called Ron Lebrecht, who after his change of command had just pulled into his driveway in Yorktown to become chief of the search and rescue school. And he basically left his family that day and came to New Orleans to support me. And I called Adrian West, who ran my command center in the Atlantic area on 9/11. Adrian is now the chief of response in the 1st District. These are multi-talented people, multi-mission people I thought could help me. And I made one request of them. I said, find me in New Orleans tomorrow. I didn't tell them how. I didn't even tell them where I was going to be. And 24 hours later, they all showed up, and their individual stories were extraordinary, what they were able to do to get down there and support me. I flew into Baton Rouge on the night of the 5th. The morning of the 6th, I received briefings from Mike Brown and other folks, and I flew on an H-60 into New Orleans, overflying the city before I landed at the convention center. It was as Captain Jones described. The city was still flooded, black water, no power, no sewage, no electricity. The smell was awful, as Captain Jones indicated. As I was landing at the convention center, I was trying to figure out, how do we get to this position 1 week later? And I found out by the end of the day that we had gotten the problem wrong. We thought we were dealing with a hurricane, and frankly, the hurricane passed in 24 hours. There was a significant amount of search and rescue, but the collapse of the levees and the collapse of the drainage canals that led from the city out to Lake Pontchartrain inundated the city, and in my view, was the equivalent of a weapon of mass effect used on the city, except there were no terrorists or malintent. And the real problem in New Orleans was they lost continuity of government. They had a standing mayor and there was a governor, but they had lost all the elements of civil society that would allow them to do this. There was no command center. They had no control over their fire, police, and emergency response folks. And while resources had poured in for a week pursuant to a disaster declaration by the president, they all were basically self-deployed. And in some cases, with the Coast Guard, we don't need orders from higher authority. We don't need coordinating authorization. We just do it. It's part of our DNA. And I'll just foot stomp where Bruce said the ability to gather everybody together in the area out at Zephyr Field and create an incident command post out of everybody that was there was absolutely extraordinary for the people that were on the ground there. So the challenge was, without preempting legally the mayor, how do you actually attack this problem and stabilize the response? Well, I sat down and had a face-to-face with Lieutenant General Russ Honore, the commander of Joint Task Force Katrina. We put command trailers on the cruise ship pier adjacent to the Iwo Jima, and we made an agreement there would be no air between us, and we were going to deal with this thing jointly. And in military parlance, I would be the supporting commander, he would be the supporting commander, and we were going to work this thing together. We divided the city into sectors and assigned each one of the sectors to one of Russ Honore's components. So, for example, the 82nd Airborne had the Central Business District. The lower 9th Ward, St. Bernard Parish, which got what I call the triple whammy. They had the storm surge, the levees overtopped and reflooded the lower 9th Ward, and then the Murphy Oil facility had a 1 million-gallon tank come off its base and slimed the whole area. That area was so bad, we gave that to the Marines, and they did remarkably well down there. Another challenge was the Louisiana National Guard. They'd been called up by the governor. We had no command and control or authority over them. So we negotiated with Lieutenant General Landreneau that we create a joint planning cell. So we effectively divided the city into sectors and began an immediate sweep. We provided high water vehicles, logistics, communication, security, administrative support, so the local police officers and state police could go house to house, touch every house to find out if somebody needed to be saved, or start the grim task of remains recovery. And if you remember, there were circles and X's and icons put on the houses to note who had been there and when they were visited. We did 2 more sweeps of the city as it was pumped out. So 3 sweeps of the city were made house to house to ensure that there was nobody left to save. I would add that when I arrived on the 6th of September, we still had 500 people a day coming out of the city that had to be rescued because they couldn't tolerate staying any longer and they had refused to evacuate. So this went on for a number of days. Once we got that set up and into a daily rhythm, we presented our plans every night to the city. If they objected to something, we changed it. We weren't there to try and assume their authorities. But once we had that in place, we basically stabilized the response, I'd say in about 72 hours. After that, it was a matter of trying to deal with the other issues. And I met with the head of Homeland Security for the Terry Ebert for the city of New Orleans on the Iwo Jima the day I arrived. And I asked him, what do you need? What can I do for you? And the first thing he said is, we need hope. The second thing he said was, we have no place to put our fire, police, and emergency responders. Unless I can get them together and coordinate what they're doing, we can't carry out our responsibilities in the city. That afternoon, working with FEMA officials in New Orleans and Tom Akin and others, we redirected a cruise ship from Galveston to Moore at the cruise ship terminal behind the Iwo Jima. We had an emergency berthing area for the fire, police, and so forth. We were successful in combing through the city, doing what we needed to do, but it was based on mutual respect and trust. And we had to create unity of effort. When you're outside the military, you're never going to have unity of command. The best you're ever going to achieve is unity of effort. That has to be predicated on mutual respect and trust to get the buy-in from everybody to do that. We were able to build a team and do that. And the people that came down there with me, Adrian West, Ron Lebrecht, Tom Akin, and Katrina Harper, were invaluable in helping me do that. Ultimately, on Friday of that week, on the 9th, I was called to Baton Rouge to meet with Secretary Chertoff. He told me to come in and close the door. And he said, there's going to be a press conference in 30 minutes. You're relieving Mike Brown of the entire response. You're going to become the principal federal official. If you're wondering how I heard about it, that's how I heard about it. He then called Mike Brown in and gave the news to Mike, which he didn't receive well. After that, there was a press conference, probably the most uncomfortable press conference I ever had. Secretary Chertoff left. Mike Brown stormed out, resigned a week later as a FEMA administrator. And I was sitting in a warehouse in Baton Rouge with my aide, and I was trying to figure out what to do next. And my aide looked at me and she goes, "Sir, what are you going to do?" I said, "Well, listen, I got a command, so I want an all-hands meeting." Well, we were in an old warehouse in Baton Rouge, had about 5,000 people at the Joint Field Office. I said, "Get as many people as you can together. I want to talk to them." On the way into the building, I had talked to a woman that worked for FEMA, and she had told me how much she appreciated the opportunity to work down there, how much she valued the interaction, and how much people appreciated what she was doing. And then she told me, but I go back to my hotel room every night and I can't turn on the television because all I see is the government, my leaders, and my agency vilified. That stuck with me. So after the news conference, I gathered everybody that I could. And I got up on a desk with a loudhailer. And I told everybody I have to go back to New Orleans. I was transferring all the coordination to Tom Akin. I said, "I'll be back. Here's how you get hold of me." And then I looked at them all. I said, "I'm giving you an order." Now, I had no legal authority to give anybody an order, but there's an old saying, you don't have sovereignty unless you can exert it, so I gave it a try. I told everybody in the room there to treat everybody they came in contact with as if they were a member of their own family. Their mother, their brother, their father, their sister. I said, if you do that, two things are going to happen. One, if you make a mistake, you're going to err on the side of doing too much, and at this point in the response, I'm okay with that. Number two, if somebody's got a problem with what you're doing, their problem's with me, not you, because I told you. At that point, people started openly weeping in the room, and there was a collective sigh that changed the barometric pressure in the building. Nobody had ever told people in very simple terms what the mission was, what the values were, as Bruce Jones talked about, why we were there, why it mattered. But more importantly, nobody ever told anybody that somebody had their back. And from there, we marched on and did as much as we could. There's still a work in progress. The lower Ninth Ward remains a place where there's a lot of stuff that's happened that's good, a lot of empty lots down there. And that extends over to Waveland, Bay St. Louis, and Gulfport, all along the Gulf Coast. So I'll stop there and see what kind of questions we got. Phil, back to you.
Thanks, Admiral Allen. It's always a pleasure to hear you speak, sir, and to hear your experience down there. Truly lessons in leadership. We do have several questions, and I'll kind of round robin and go back from we'll start where we began and then come to you, sir. So for Captain Jones, when your crews were denied being able to deliver those that they rescued to the hospitals and the parishes, what did the boat crews do?
Yeah, so we were from the first night, the first afternoon when we got there, we were picking people up and putting them either taking them to the Superdome or taking them to any dry land where there were emergency response personnel around. Where we saw a fire truck, where we saw police cars, we were putting them down on dry land. After a day or two, we had LZs at places like the Cloverleaf and University of New Orleans where there was dry land, and there were literally thousands of survivors gathered there waiting to be transported out, waiting for help. And our great frustration as the rescuers was that we were expecting the state to step up and provide emergency shelters, provide transportation, provide water. There was literally no water that was being provided for these people. So it was, in fact, on the 31st, which is Wednesday morning, the third day, the first water to be delivered to New Orleans was a Coast Guard C-130 loaded with like 170,000 cases of water that landed because they had heard us telling our chain of command that we needed water for these survivors, and it wasn't being delivered by anybody else. So Coast Guard people signed a purchase order, got the water, and flew it into MSY, which is the first heavy lift aircraft into New Orleans delivering supplies, but Coast Guard aircraft. Not our mission, but they stepped up to do it. So we took them to these LZs, and frankly, sometimes you had to drop people off even when they were waving you off and telling you to go away because there was no place else. And it made no sense. It was not feasible for 865s to take 5 people and fly an hour each way to Baton Rouge. We were just plugging people off rooftops. I think it was JFK that once said, governing is choosing between bad and worse. And what we were doing is taking them from a terrible position into a better position that still wasn't very good. So pulling them out of an attic or off a rooftop, dropping them on dry land where there's not much for them, and just hoping that, the bigger government, federal and state response would take them to a shelter soon after that. But unfortunately, they were waiting 3, 4, 5 days before that happened.
Problem solving on the fly, sir. And for anybody that doesn't realize the pain it can be to order water in the Coast Guard, that's a pretty heavy lift, I think, for that C-130 to get water. There's a lot of regulations over that. Thank you, sir. For Mr. Cooper, question: can you tell us about your company's role in helping the Coast Guard to pick up people off the barges near your office?
To pick up people off the barges near our office. Yeah, I don't recall that exact instance. We did help rescue people from downtown New Orleans, from the Riverwalk there, and get them back. We had a lot of survivors at the Coast Guard, that Captain Jones's group were getting, and I want to say some of those went to Algiers Naval Support when y'all would drop them off there. I'm not saying they didn't want them. That's a bad way to put it, but I don't think they had adequate housing rooms, whatnot, safety for them. So they were getting on the levee to walk past our office to the ferry there at Algiers Point, and that became a pretty hectic scene for a couple of days, to be quite honest.
Sure, yes, sir. Admiral Allen, one for you, sir. Any tips or recommendations on how to apply the nimble, flexible, and responsive traits in local communities?
Well, first of all, I think one of the main characteristics of the Coast Guard allows us to succeed. I call it being bureaucratically multilingual. We can talk to DOD in jokes, so we can talk to the local fire chief and incident command. We translate across that and we create unity of effort. We're nimble and flexible by nature in the Coast Guard. What we do is we engender that in other agencies, other people, and other stakeholders. And we have to do that because many times we're the only legal authority to be able to direct something or do something, but we don't have the resources. Nobody has the resources to attack a big problem like this. So your only recourse is to create unity of effort. And that takes leadership that is empathetic, requires emotional intelligence, and in my view, leaders in the Coast Guard that are lifelong learners and constantly trying to figure out how to be a better person, because the better person you are, the better you interact in those environments with multiple stakeholders to achieve the results the American public should expect of us.
Yes, sir. And Mr. Cooper, I'll put the same question to you, sir, for a business that's concerned with all the things that come with business and not a government function. The nimble and flexible part, I think you guys are pretty nimble and flexible in your response. What lessons did you learn as a company? What did you take away from that?
I'll tell you I said this a little while ago, and not to throw Captain Paskowitz under the bus, but I do have an email that I think I've saved somewhere where it was pretty much a carte blanche. Y'all do what you got to do. type email. And I appreciated that candor and that honesty, because there weren't, I don't want to say there were no rules, but there was no rule book. There was no handbook, especially from my standpoint, in our standpoint. Everything that the quote unquote old timers, the guys that have been through Camille and Frederick here in Mobile, other storms, our mayors, nothing had happened like this. Like Admiral Allen said, and Captain Jones talked about, the storm was one thing. Had the levees not failed, had we not had the flooding a couple days, a day prior, a day following, going forward after that, it wouldn't have been that bad. I mean, I'm not saying it was a good scene, but we would have recovered a whole hell of a lot faster. The biggest thing I learned from it, and my brother and I try to use today in our various companies, is we're a team, and the team starts at the bottom, starts at the top. Nobody's any better, any worse. Yes, we've all got different job duties, job titles, but in times, when times get tough, you can look around the room and see who you can trust. And I had 70 some odd guys there that I'd go to war with any day of the week. And by surrounding ourselves with team members like that, we know that all of the Cooper companies, I'm not gonna say we know, we think we're prepared for whatever may be next.
Great answer, sir. And let's see, Captain Jones, we had one for you, sir. You mentioned all the units that had responded. Do you any comments on their use of the Coast Guard reserves? From your experience there.
Well, we don't have an aviation reserves in the Coast Guard. So from the air station standpoint, we didn't have a lot of the reserve forces at the air station. They certainly were called up though throughout the whole AOR, whether it's port security units, whether it was boat forces. I mean, there was a lot of reserves that were called into the area. We had a port security unit that came and stood up all their tents they just come back from Gitmo, I think, and they stood up all their tents and other facilities for our folks to live in temporarily for the next few months at Air Station New Orleans. So as far as flying, we didn't have any reserves that were flying, but certainly on the support side of the house, there was a team, and I forget the acronym of them, that came down from St. Louis that wired up all the trailers the FEMA trailers that they brought. We probably had 40 trailers on our facility because our hangar had been severely damaged. It was unusable. All of the maintenance shops were unusable. Berthing was unusable. So we had all these trailers set up, and reserves came down from St. Louis and wired that all up for us. So yeah, I would say the reserve support, especially on the logistics side, was just incredible and really key to success. And I'll add also that auxiliaries came in and did quite a bit. There was an auxiliary boat at Station New Orleans that was used to provide berthing and also to cook. They used their galley on that boat to cook meals for the crew. So there was a whole lot of auxiliary and reserve support that made this disaster response possible.
Admiral Allen, I'd put the same question out to you, sir. Did you just tell the Coast Guard Reserve to meet you in New Orleans when you headed down, or what was your experience with the reserves there?
They were already there. I was going to the airport, and Vice Admiral Vivian Craig called me, the Atlantic Area Commander. She had taken the Senior Reserve Officer for Atlantic Area, Rear Admiral John Acton, and deployed him to the Emergency Operations Center in Baton Rouge. And while he didn't have an active role, what he did was he just kind of walked around and kind of absorbed what was going on. He identified some of the dysfunctionalities, and how they're trying to manage the operation, some misunderstanding of what it was they were trying to do vis-a-vis just an emergency declaration and flowing resources in versus trying to build up the command and control capability to do something in the city of New Orleans. So when I arrived at the Emergency Operations Center on the 9th to the 5th of September, John Acton gave me a full brief. It was invaluable in the meeting I had the next morning with Mike Brown, which was a very tough meeting before I went down to New Orleans trying to assess what the situation was. But throughout my entire career, the reserves have been incredible. I fought very hard to increase their end strength and our ability to call them up. And I don't know if folks generally know, but there's usually an annual delegation of authority from the Secretary of Homeland Security to the Commandant that gives you call-up authority in a disaster where you don't have to ask permission. You can employ them when you need them. And that was certainly done during Katrina. It was also done during the oil spill.
Sure. And one more for you, Admiral Allen. What's changed for the Coast Guard since Katrina, specifically in terms of how the government relies on the service and how its funding, policy, and oversight's been affected?
Well, frankly, I think we're an example for others. We don't stop and see whether we're funded or not. We don't stop and see, is this an approved operation? You know, in the Department of Defense, when you deploy forces, it has to go up to the Secretary of Defense to sign what they call an order book. What makes the Coast Guard different are our principles of operation, and you can see them in Coast Guard Pub 1, our doctrinal pub. It's how we think and act, and what it means is in the absence of higher authority, you're compelled and required to act. I see Olaf Sabo there on the screen. We'll talk about him maybe in a minute. I see Bruce nodding his head. The principle of on-scene initiative. If you have resources, you're there and you can do something, you need to do it. The principle of a clear objective, what it is we're trying to do. The principle of managed risk. You know, how do we trade off keeping our forces where they can still respond, but not hesitate to put them where they're needed. The principle of effective presence. These are all things that if you put them all together, characterize how we act in a situation where there is no other guidance. We call it doctrine because above standard operating procedures and training tactics and procedures, they're basic elements that you need to think about when you're doing something you have no other direction. So there's no better example of how Bruce handled his people there at Air Station New Orleans, consistent with Coast Guard doctrine without orders from higher authority. That is, in my view, the genius of the service.
Thanks, sir.
By the way, I'll tell a story about Olaf Sabo. You had his picture of, he's the blonde guy by the helicopter there. Olaf's quite a character. He was a lieutenant then. He currently is the commanding officer of Air Station North. There he is, the commanding officer of Air Station North Bend. He won the Distinguished Flying Cross. I think in something like 3 or 4 days, he saved 143 people during Katrina. He actually came to Coast Guard headquarters to get his award, and he wanted to meet with me. So he came into my office when I was commandant, and I was getting ready to leave somewhere. And I shook his hand. We had a great discussion. I got almost to the elevator and forgot something. And when I came back in, Olaf was on my desk with his feet up on the desk, having somebody take a picture of him. So he was so busted. And he still became the commanding officer at North Bend today.
That's a pretty epic move.
You got to know Olaf. Bruce, you want to comment?
That's a great story. I did the exact same thing to the Atlantic Area Commander back about 1993. I'd been in some big rescue out of North Carolina in '60, and he got some big national award. We went to the area commander's office on Governor's Island, and he stepped out, and I had my picture taken with my feet on his desk, but I didn't get caught. You know, I'll add one thought here, as I know we're getting towards the end, but I've told people, many people come up to me and say, well, God, you're in New Orleans during Katrina. That must have been horrible. I said, you know, for a Coast Guardsman, the only thing worse than being in New Orleans during Katrina was to not be in New Orleans during Katrina. I mean, that was what we lived for. That mission was what we all trained for. It's why we joined. And, you know, I realized later on, my whole career had been building up to make me prepared to be able to be in command of that unit during that storm. I didn't know that at the time, but you know, that's what the way Coast Guard careers progress, the missions that we do around the clock, around the country, 365 days a year, the search and rescue cases, the oil spill responses, being part of the different task force and exercises, all those things build up the skills and competencies that allow the Coast Guard to respond so well after a Hurricane Katrina, or Rita, or Ike, or Gustav, or you name it.
Great answer, sir. Mr. Cooper, we'll end with you if we can. We got one for you. Why do you feel that the Coast Guard is important to our country?
That's a good one there. You know, to echo what Admiral Allen was saying, and I got to be careful how I answer this, because every branch of government, every military branch is important from a protection standpoint. I'm not about to go there right now, but the fact that he's saying they're able to do things without having to go through some other red tape, let's call it, is awesome. And I got to watch that, because there, you know, the understatement of the day was when Admiral Allen got down there and the left hand was not talking to the right hand. The left hand didn't know there was a right hand. It was a mess. and we can go on and on and on about that. But through Admiral Allen's leadership and the Coast Guard coming in, that to me right there is why it's so important. Because yes, your missions are, from what the average layman thinks, your missions are to protect, whether it be drug smuggling or if somebody's out in a fishing boat and capsizes. Yes, the Coast Guard does all those things, but above and beyond y'all's the call of duty that y'all stepped up and perform each and every day, but especially when there's a natural disaster, i.e. a Katrina or any other hurricane or oil spill or God knows what's next. I know the Coast Guard will be there and have every American's back and react when needed.
Solid, sir. Thank you. Well, thank you again, Admiral Allen. Thank you, Captain Jones and Mr. Cooper, for your participation today and for your work in New Orleans 15 years ago, for the leadership you displayed in those 33,500 lives that were saved during that time. We hope that everyone enjoyed today's discussion. We invite you to learn more about the National Coast Guard Museum Association at coastguardmuseum.org. There you can sign up for our newsletter, become a plank owner, or visit the museum on social media at the links that are now at the bottom of your screen. Thank you again, everyone. You guys stay safe in these COVID times. Hope to talk to you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.